Hey everyone, welcome back to CodeStorm. In this video, we will learn how to use Firebase Firestore in a Spring Boot project. Let's get started. So today we will be using one of the key feature of Firebase, that is Cloud Firestore. Cloud Firestore is a scalable NoSQL database that is well suited for a wide range of applications including mobile apps, web apps, and serverless functions. So let's get started with creating a new project in Firebase. Click on this create a project, enter the project name which you want. So in my case, I will just name it as project YouTube 2. Click on continue. This is recommended, so I will leave it as it is. I'll be selecting this default account for Firebase. Click on create project. So we are in the home page of our project. And as I said, today we will be using Cloud Firestore, which is a NoSQL database. So to create a Spring Boot project, I'm inside the Spring Initializer website. For this as well, I will provide a link in the description. So just rename the project metadata over here as you want. So in my case, I will just rename it to com.coachtown Firebase with Spring Boot. And I will be using a Gradle project. If you want, you can select the Maven project and the language will be Java and the version will be 17. Now let's add one dependency, Spring Web. If you want, we can also add Lombok. So for now, I will leave these two dependencies by default. Now let's click on the generate button. The zip file is downloaded. Now let's unzip it and import it into our IDE. In my case, I will be using IntelliJ IDE. I have imported the project into the IntelliJ IDE and the application is running as expected without any errors. So now we have a Firebase project and a Spring Boot project. Now you might be thinking how to link the Spring Boot project with the Firebase. So in order to do that, Firebase will provide one secret key, a JSON file, which we need to keep it in our local. This secret key allows us to interact with Firebase. So now let's see how to download that JSON file. So as I said earlier, this is our home page of our project. Let's click on this project overview settings icon, project settings. So once you're into this page, click on the service accounts. And once you're into this page, click on generate new private key. Please read this. This is a private key gives access to your project's Firebase services. So we need to keep it confidential and never store it in a public repository. So generate key. The file is downloaded. I will rename it. So now let's go back to our Firebase project. So here, let's click on this Java option. If you see here, it shows a way on how to integrate our Spring Boot project with Firebase, right? So when I last checked, this Firebase options.builder method is deprecated. So I will be showing a new way or a other way which we can use in our local. So now let's go back to our Spring Boot project. In order to use Firebase components in our project, we need to add one library into our project. So and that library dependency is this one, com.google.firebase Firebase admin. So in order to get the latest version, let's go to our Maven repository. So here we get this Firebase admin. Let's click on the latest version. It is 9.3.0 and copy this. Now let's go back to our IntelliJ. So I've added this. Now let's rebuild this project. Once successfully imported, now let's create a new package inside our Java folder and name it as config. I'll create a new class inside this. The class name would be Firebase config. And this is a configuration class. So I will add an annotation. Inside this, we need to create a bin to link our Firebase project with this Spring Boot project. If you see here, it says Firebase app.initialize app. So this is the same code which we had in our Firebase website. That is this. But here we are passing the options. So in options, we are passing this credentials, which contains our path to service account key. So now I will show a way how to use this secret key without importing into our project. We need to set two variables in our environment variables in our run configuration. Those two variables are Google Cloud Project and Google Application Credentials. Google Cloud Project is nothing but the ID of the Firebase project. Now let's go back to our Firebase, and this is our project ID. Let's copy this and paste it in our IntelliJ. That is here. And let's copy the path of the JSON file which we downloaded earlier. Right click, copy as path. Now let's go back to IntelliJ again and paste the path over here. Remove this double inverted comma and move this into a single line. Now let's go back to our edit configurations of the main file. Make sure it is main file, environment variables, and paste the content. Now click on apply and OK. So the application has started without any error. If we don't pass these values in our environment variables in our runner configuration, it will fail because it will not be able to recognize what's the project ID and what's the path for Google application credentials. So make sure to pass both the project ID and the Google application credentials in the environment variables in the runner config. So in order to use Firestore in the development mode or from the local, we need to perform some changes in Firebase. Now let's do that. Now let's go back to our Firebase website. Here, click on build and select Firestore database. So once we are here, click on this create database. So it is recommended that we should use the location which is near to us. So as this is a just test project, I will be leaving as it is, but there are multiple options which we can select from. Click on next. And this is the main thing which we need to use, that is start in test mode. So by using this, it allows us to perform these operations without any authentication or without any rules. So in the development mode, it's recommended to use this start in test mode when we are just getting started. So now let's click on this create button. So this is our Firestore database where we can add our collections and documents from our Spring Boot project. This is how we set up Firestore for development mode, which allows us to perform this DB operations without any rules or authentication. Now, let's start with the Spring Boot code by creating the Doe class. I will create a Doe package here and create a new class and name it as user. So inside user, I will paste some main fields which I will be using in this tutorial, that is ID, username, email ID, and created at. So I've used two annotations here. Both of them are with respect to Firebase Firestore. So this document ID will give us the primary key or a ID which we can use to fetch this username, email ID, all those values. And this server timestamp will automatically generate a current timestamp and updates into our DB. We'll show these operations. And now I will add a Lombok annotations at data. So this will provide getters, setters, and all the required constructors for the variables used here. This is our user DAO layer. If you want to learn more about Lombok, I've created a one more video on that. I will provide a link in the description, or I will add a info card at the top. So now let's create one service layer, a package, and name it as service. So inside this, I'll be creating one class, that is user service. Here we will add one Spring Boot annotation, that is service. From our service, we will be doing the important CRUD operations. So in order to do that, we need to use Firestore. This Firestore bean we have already created in our Firebase config, that is this block. So make sure to create this in order to use the Firestore bean in our user service class. So I could have used auto wired here, but I will be using a constructor injection this time instead of variable injection. Now let's start with creating the user. I will create a method which will return the string, and I will name the method as create user. And inside this, I will pass user DTO. So here, what it will do is it will create, if the user's collection does not exist. In our case, it doesn't exist as of now. So it will create a collection called as users, and here it will create a document ID. Here, if you notice, I have not set any document ID over here. So it will create a random document ID on its own, and then add our user values which we pass from our file. Now let's create a controller class for this and call this create user from our controller layer. I've created a user controller, and here from the user controller, I'm using this REST controller annotation, request mapping, Lombok all arguments constructor, our user service, and this is the post mapping which will call our user service create user. So in user service also, I've made a small change, that is inside this create user, instead of throwing directly in from our method, I've handled it inside a try catch block. Now let's add small logger here, SLF4J. This is also a Lombok annotations which will allow us to create a logger. So what create API does is, so whatever the user details which we pass from our controller through a request body, it will create a NoSQL structure in our Firebase Firestore under this collection with the random document ID. Now let's test this. The application will be running in 8080 port. The application has started. So in this case, I will be using IntelliJ's request HTTP handler itself, but in your case, you can use Postman or any other applications. So this is our endpoint, and we need to pass only two fields, that is username and email ID. The ID and the created at fields will be automatically updated by our Firebase Firestore. So now let's remove these two fields and just pass name and email ID. So if this passes, we should get a document ID. Now let's click on this. The same operation you can do in your Postman as well. So if you notice, we get the user ID. And now let's go to our Firebase Firestore and see whether the data is updated or not. Let's refresh the page. Yes, so now the user's collection is created and the document ID is matching with what we got in the local, and the values, as you notice, the username, email ID, and the created at. If you remember, we did not pass the created at field, but as we have used that server timestamp annotation, it will automatically update the value. And if you notice, the ID field is also not there because the ID here, which is means the document ID, and there will be a no duplicate value for that. This is also a very good option for us. So in order to get the user by using the ID, so we'll be using firestore.collection and the collection's name, that is users in our case. And inside the document, we need to pass the ID which we want to fetch. And then it will be users.get to object. So please remember this to object, which will convert the value which we get from our Firestore into the object which we want. And make sure that the field name should be the same whatever we are getting from the Firebase Firestore. So in our case, we need all. So we will be fetching all the values once I created this get user method, I added a get mapping as well inside a user controller, where I will be calling this get user using this path variable. Now let's again generate this get request. So this is the get API. And if you notice, this is the ID which we got for this user. So when we call this API, we will be getting this exact value as expected. That is, ID is this, username is Alex, email ID is alex@gmail.com, and timestamp seconds and nanos. So this is create and read operations from our Spring Boot project to Firebase Firestore. Now let's update the user. So this time also it will be the same user ID. And here inside this user, we will be having the user ID, name, email, and the created at timestamp. So I'm using this firestore.collection. Users will be same. And as we already know the document ID, we will be passing the document ID. And in this case, I will be updating the username. So in this case, as I said, I'll be updating only one field. But if you want to update multiple fields, if you have a user collections, what we can do is we can use a map and pass the field name here and the value which you want to update here, and again field name here and the value which you want to update here, user.getEmailID. If you have multiple collections which you want to multiple fields which you want to update, we can use this approach and pass map inside this. But if you want to update only a single field or a single value, we can use directly over here instead of using this map. Once we do that, we will be getting the get update time of when it was updated. And similarly, and I've added a put mapping in our controller layer, which will call our update user. So now let's update the username from Alex to Alex123. Okay, I've done that and I've already got the last updated time. Now let's go back to our Firebase Firestore website and see the name. Firebase Firestore, and here if you notice, the username has changed from Alex to Alex123. If you use set over here instead of update and pass only username, then all the other values other than username will be deleted and will be set to null, and only username will be updated. So make sure to use update instead of set. Or if you're using set and pass all the values over here, then it is fine. But if you want to update only a single values or a specific fields, make sure to use the update. And before this, you also need to make sure whether this ID which is passed from the payload is valid and the details which are passed are matching. So we can do that. We already know how to get the user, right? We can use this approach. Oh, sorry, this should be inside this if block, inside this try block. We already know how to fetch the user based on the ID. We can do the same thing over here. So if it is valid, then we can update the username or any other fields which we want. Now, finally, let's see how to delete this user. In order to save the time, I've added this delete method. Here I'm using this Firestore collection and I'm passing the document ID and I'm using this delete option. So this will delete our document. Let's delete the user now. And yes, we get the updated timestamp. Now let's go to our Firebase Firestore and see whether the user is deleted. As expected, the user is deleted. So this is CRUD operations with Firestore using Spring Boot project. I have a plan to create more videos with Firebase and Spring Boot. Do let me know if you have any queries in the comment section. We'll reply as soon as possible. Thanks for watching.